All right, let's talk about love and war and all the rest of it. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me finally wrapping up my talks about the main sequence of Black Company novels by Glen Cook. This will be the last one. We'll be talking about Soldiers Live. And if I will talk about Port of Shadow, I'll leave that one up to you. Let me know in the comments. I might take a while to getting back to that one because, you know, it is so different from the series, and I feel having a bit of a break between these main books and these short stories that are set much earlier in the sequence may actually help getting to understand them or evaluate them, because reading them right after Soldiers Live is not necessarily the best way of doing it, in my humble opinion. But let me know if you're even interested in those. I know a lot of people don't like them. Anyway, let's get started. We'll do the usual thing. I'll give you a quick synopsis, but since this is the last book of a series, I don't think we have to do much spoiler-free stuff and kind of go quickly into the more spoilerish evaluation of what I thought about the book, what I liked about the book, what I think about why it is so fucking good and such a brilliant ending for one of my favorite, if not the favorite fantasy series of all time. But yeah, let's do the usual song and dance. Well, without song and without dance, because I don't dance. All right. Soldiers Live picks up after Water Sleeps, where Water Sleeps had the mantra, Water Sleeps, but enemy never rests. This one has Soldiers Live and Wonder Why, which was mentioned near the end of the last volume, just as Water Sleeps was mentioned near the end of She is the Darkness, a game that Glen Cook knows and loves to play. Anyway, so we are back with Croker as narrator, as analyst. They are set up in a different country beyond the glittering plain. They have been stuck there for 4 years, building up their strength under Sleepy's leadership. Sleepy is officially captain now. Croker's back doing the annals. They're building up their strength to then go back to Taglia's to defeat Soulcatcher, get Mogaba, and, you know, get everyone back on their feet. And I don't know. That's basically the plan. And we basically follow the preparations, we follow the conflicts between the old guard, the people that have been under the glittering plane, the new guard, all of that stuff. And, well, all the different resolutions that need to come after such a long time. Will Taglia's be free? Who will rule? What happens to all these people? We will talk about all of that in the spoilery section, because this, you know, I don't know, is obviously supposed to be a synopsis. So yeah, lots of big endings and also small endings, lots of personal endings. And it does end very tenderly, I'll say that. And I think it's one of the best endings for a fantasy series I've read in my time. And also that's something we will talk about later on. So yeah, go read the goddamn book. You've made it this far, right? And let's have us a conversation on what makes it so great, because I think that's more valuable. So go read it. And let's start with the first one, that is the difference between the great and the small. And this is always something that I feel Glen Cook has handled really well, and we saw it a lot in the last two books, those being She is a Darkness and Water Sleeps, had it sort of split in that She is a Darkness is a lot of large picture stuff in the most cases, with all these immense battles and everything, and then on the other hand Water Sleeps is a very up close and personal small scale novel with focusing mostly on the personal dynamics between Sleepy and Sarah and Tobo and all the gang trying to survive under the oppressive regime of Soulcatcher. This time around we have sort of a split, with Croker mostly being sort of focused on small-scale stuff himself, trying to sort of come to terms with what happened on the glittering plane, coming to terms with the fact that he's growing old, that Lady's growing old, that he may be taking it really badly, but she's taking it even poorer, Goblin is gone, One Eye is dying, all of these elements, we kind of skip between the two, and what is interesting is how those large and small elements kind of influence each other and mirror each other all the time. And I think that is one of the strengths of the novel. There were parts in, I think, She is the Darkness, for example, where I thought it was like just like large-scale battle descriptions. It just like took too long or moved too fast. On the other hand, it was like, yeah, we just killed 10,000 people in like 2 pages. I don't know if that's yeah. So we don't. We have some of that here, but it's sort of in a different way, and I think there is a general atmosphere to the novel that I think works really well. That whole sentence, that mantra of soldiers live and wonder why, is something that comes across really well, because while there is a lot of violence here, most of it is incredibly senseless. When you look at like some of the sort of books in the middle of the series, the violence was usually for reasons, right? The Black Company had to fight to get rid of the Dominator, to make sure that the Dominator doesn't come back. The Black Company needs to fight the Shadow Masters because they need to go through this place to go home and so forth. At this point in time, the Black Company does not need to do any of this, really. They're basically employed by themselves. They just want to right some old wrongs or perceived wrongs and get everything sorted, more or less. And that's sort of where the senselessness comes in. There's no external reason to go back to Katawar, Katawar they can go back to. Like, there's no external reason to go back to Taglias and defeat Soulcatcher beyond just wanting to do that. Yes, there may be the Year of the Skulls and everything, but that also is only happening over there. It's personal motivations that are turned into reasons for large-scale war, and the result is terrible, because everyone suffers. Most people die, senseless deaths, and I think there's a message in there. I think one that mostly people that have a military background kind of understand, the feeling of going not necessarily for, the big goals of truth, freedom, and so forth. We have had wars in history where that was the case. Like, fighting against Nazis is not a personal goal. I mean, there's good reasons to kill Nazis, is my point, in World War II and so forth. But a lot of situations, you have wars that feel very different than that. And I think looking at when this book was written and when this book came out, we had thoroughly entered the age of wars that were fought for less than morally pure reasons. Like, this is the 2000s. There's war happening or going to happen in Iraq. There's Afghanistan. A lot of these military interventions of the 90s and 2000s are not those morally pure military interventions. I think that sense of senselessness is something that seeps into the novel in that regard, and I think that makes it well, I don't want to say powerful, but it gives it a very specific sort of like air of tiredness, of exhaustion, and fatalism that was not necessarily there in previous novels. And I think it works really well with a military fantasy series of this length to end in exhaustion and tiredness, and just like having been through all of this, slowly losing purpose, asking the question like, why am I still around? Is there something I have to do? And the answer, like, maybe not, or maybe, and finding reasons to keep going on, or finding reasons to end one's career in some form of, with some form of closure, I guess. And that's the interesting thing, to see how many of the characters in these books manage to find closure and how many don't. And that's definitely something we need to talk about later on in this book in this conversation again. What I want to talk about first, though, is something that Glen Cook does so incredibly well, and that is so rare in fantasy, and that I think we've seen a bit more in recent times. But let's talk a bit about world building. Because it's been around for a while, the Glittering Stone Plane, right? We've kind of known that it is sort of this place where you can go to different worlds. It came up in Water Sleeps. It was already mentioned in She is the Darkness. But here now we see the whole Glittering Plane do its thing. And this is sort of a falling back to stuff that we saw already in mostly The White Rose, which is when Glen Cook, who usually does a very sparse and spare world building or world description, because it's all very first-person narrative of people that are running around in places that they already know. They don't need to tell us about that. We get very little detail, for example, for Ladies' Empire in the North. We get a few more details for Taglias in the south, where we are sort of probably filling in all the blanks from all our prejudices we ever had about India and the Indian subcontinent. Here we're back in places that are unique, the same way that the Plane of Fear was in White Rose. And we're back in that we're also like very much out of the realm of the what you usually call fantasy. Glen Cook has always done fantasy in a more technological way, I would argue, like the way you have fantasy that does stuff that we would do by technology, right? We have like the carpets that work like helicopters or work like planes and stuff like that. We have always had that. Now we have the glittering plane, which is very much a crossroads between different worlds. So suddenly we have a multiverse of places that are all connected by this basically huge turntable where people can cross from world to world. And it's run by this demon. It's run basically like technology, and that's just like really cool and something we don't necessarily see in any form of like epic fantasy, especially not in the more like Tolkien-inspired classic form of fantasy, where we have sort of like these guardrails to reality that we don't necessarily need in fantasy because it's fantastic, but like in that more myth and epic-inspired fantasy, we have these guardrails that are always there. It's like you can have orcs and elves, but you definitely can't have like gigantic crossroads between parallel universes that run basically like a train turntable. We can't have flying carpets that work like helicopters. We can't do these kind of things. And Glen Cook doesn't do any of that. Like if you want talking stones, you get talking stones. If you want flying whales, you get flying whales. If you want gigantic undead golems or somehow created demons nailed to thrones that rule like an empire, that turntable between parallel universes, you get that. And I think it's inspiring to see this wildness in world building that jumps up back at you like in moments when you don't realize, when you're like, well, this is just like basic fantasy, and suddenly you're like, what? And Soldiers Live does that once again, and it does so with bravura. As I said, like we've seen more of this before, but Glen Cook really manages to play with this idea that stories are told in all these worlds, and these worlds are somewhat similar, but not completely the same. We have like stories from each of these worlds that are sort of similar when you have these different origin stories of Kina, when you have these different origin stories of the Black Cow, of these different companies. You have all these myths and stories that are always somewhat similar, but never quite the same. And this is sort of like where things get meta, right? Which is where the idea of dropping, say, names and titles from his other book series, like Surrender to the Will of the Night from the Instrumentalities of the Night, or Shadow of All Night Falling from the Dread Empire series, could mean more than just being a cheeky way of making a joke. It could also mean that because someone says that, like, yeah, that's something that people say in my world. It's like, are these different parts of the of Glen Cook's fictional universe sort of connected through the glittering plane? Because there's 16 worlds out there in this way. He doesn't actually go there and say that, but he leaves open these possibilities. Now you can go and create your your Marvel Cinematic Universe or your multiverse there. You can create your Cosmeres or whatever. Glen Cook doesn't go there, but he leaves open these possibilities, and I think that's like one of the strengths of the Black Company in general, is that it always leaves open possibilities for the imagination, and in the way it does these kind of things. So that's something I found very, very interesting. Now let's talk once again about age. Because the company is getting old, and Croker is constantly complaining about it. You have all these other people getting old. Obviously, the book starts with a real gut punch when we see the final days of One Eye and Mother Gota. And I think I want to talk about this for a second before we move on. The way Glen Cook manages to build that relationship between One Eye and Mother Gota from the outside by people who are full of scorn for those two. Like Mother Gota being called the troll for being who she is, and One Eye being not always described in the most flattering terms either. And then them sort of finding some form of peace together, I found really touching in a way. It's like, this should not happen or should not be possible in fantasy novels. It doesn't follow any of those rules. It does, however, follow the rules of life in a lot of ways. And even the way that Cook manages to describe people in sometimes almost insulting terms, right? But also giving reasons, like the way that Mother Gotha being always angry and so forth, a lot of that being then tied back to her having gout and all these other constant pain, being constantly in pain and so forth. And yeah, that stuff can make you very, very angry and crabby indeed. And having all these sort of elements in there, he manages to instill a form of pathos in the relationship and the end of Gotha and One Eye. Like the way that you fear it's One Eye, and then you come there and then you realize it's Gotha that has died, and then One Eye still dies shortly afterwards. That I found done in an incredibly touching way for a military fantasy. It's certainly the kind of thing that makes me choke up a bit, to put it mildly. And we need to talk more about One Eye, obviously, later on, because, But anyway, it starts with that gut punch, and then you have all these people ruminating on getting older and trying to do, like, one final thing they want to do, and each of them has a thing they want to do. And sometimes you don't realize what that thing is, and sometimes you find out later, and sometimes they achieve it, and sometimes they don't. And... those ruminations on getting older, I think, are very pertinent. Obviously, Glen Cook is no longer a young man. He wasn't a young man when he wrote these books, so you can feel that creeping in. It's certainly something that I've said this before. I feel we can do with more of that in fantasy, because older people are just as, alive and just as much part of the universe as younger people. And older people are just as capable of heroics as anyone else, or like heroics, probably the wrong word here, because this is not about heroes. This is about, people doing the right thing. So that I found just like very, very touching in a way it was handled. Now, obviously, we come to the next part, which is, of course, Katovar. Croker finally gets there. He is disappointed. He accidentally or on purpose lets other people destroy the world. So maybe that was not actually his life's goal. We kind of realize that in a way, because knowledge is more important for Croker in that regard. What I find interesting about Katovar and the Land of Unknown Shadows, and up to a point also what we see later in Taglias, and I think it's stronger in this book than it was in a lot of older books, although it has always been there. Glen Cook has a lot of class consciousness, if you want to call it this way. He's very much about, a lot of these books are very much about the fact that people in power feel that they are better than anyone else, and feel that they can get away with more than everyone else. That's certainly something we see in our world as well, right? You just have to look at like what the billionaire class and people in politics are doing. Power in our world is usually just like having a lot of money and resources, but having that sort of rub in your face, and how that is something that can dehumanize you in a lot of ways, is one of the great themes of the series. Obviously, Lady is someone who is trying to reconnect to normal humanity after losing her powers. We have this sort of mirrored with the two girls here, the Arcana and her sister, whose name just escapes me, Chukrat. Trying to reconnect. We have other people failing at it. Obviously, Soulcatcher is never able to regain her humanity or find any humanity because she's so far gone with power mad. But you also have like the other Vorashk mages who are incapable of doing that. You have a lot of these situations, this question of like, does power make you less than human, and are you able to sort of recapture humanity in some way, shape, or form, is one of the key themes of the entire series, and it gets laid out again here in a lot of detail. And that I found very interesting. On the other hand, you have Tobo, who starts out very human and is in danger of losing his humanity, going over to the dark once his guardrails go away. His father dies and his mother die, and he loses all these connections, and he starts turning to the dark and starts torturing people. And well, obviously, in this case, the idea is that his sorcerer's lover, Chukrat, will be that kind of moral guardrail. And I think those ideas, like who keeps power in check, and keeps power like wedded to the human in a lot of ways, to humanity and human nature, is one of those core questions that will come back again and again in these series. And it is once again very clear and stark in this novel, because this is sort of like Cook making his final points on the main arch of the series. Yes, I know there will be more books, but So let's go to those answers and what they may be. And they are friendship and love. this is also something that we have seen before, and it comes up again. It's like a lot of these problems are because people never learn to say "I love you," and this is the first time this is actually uttered, because you remember when Croker and Lady finally get together at the end of Shadow Games. It's like he just Croker said they said those those three stupid words, and he doesn't spell it out. But here we have a scene where Croker tells Lady that he loves her, and we have the love between, say, One Eye and Goblin that is such a key thing, which we realize once Goblin gets reanimated by Kina and gets saved by Goblin, by One Eye's spear and One Eye's hat. So, like, the last 4 or 5 years, like, all the time, he's been working on a way to help his friend, to save his friend, whom he loved in a lot of ways. And you have this idea that, toxic masculinity being one of those things that didn't get called toxic masculinity when these books were written, but Cook is aware of the fact that a lot of this is machismo that is really dangerous in a lot of ways, and that love and friendship are probably the one thing that keep us human, that keep us sort of on the level, basically, and keep us doing things. And when those elements go away, we are at loose. And Soulcatcher not having any form of love lets her lose that. Mogaba as well. He's holding on most of the time because of his code of morals, but it's self-love at the end of the day that kind of got him out, into trouble when he just wanted to be the best and so forth. So all of that, I think, is interesting. And when we look at who achieves their goals, it's those who have friendship and love, and those obviously being mostly, One Eye succeeds by, helping Goblin. Goblin succeeds because of One Eye's help. Sleepy, who does not have any real love for anyone, dies a incredibly pathetic, pathos-laden, not pathetic, terrible death, which is really sad in the way that someone like Sleepy is described from the outside. I found really interesting, touching in a lot of ways, and also very sad. Willow Swan dies pointlessly. A lot of people die pointlessly in this book, and I think this is one of the key things here, right? Like, death is pointless, war is pointless, unless you have a good moral reason. Here's no good moral reason. And we end in sort of a mirroring, in a way, of the first book. And I said that, when I talked about Water Sleeps, these last books are sort of mirroring the first books. This is very much the case here, I think, because with that final, big switch, when Croker becomes the Golem Shivetya, and runs the glittering plane and can go everywhere, and his big love being obviously on the one hand knowledge, and he can just finally know shit and just be there, and on the other hand he can go and give Lady back her powers one by one, and maybe hopefully sort of keep her in check through love. And that's the greatest gift he can give in that case, is giving her a way to come to terms with herself, and it's very clear in a way that, Cook said that, she's insane to all kinds of standards. She never had a chance to not be insane because of, where she grew up, in which, level of power and class she grew up. But there is still, something in there, and maybe you can do something about it. Maybe you can keep her in check. That is just, one of the reasons why I think, and I've said this before, The Black Company at its core is a love story. It's a love story about what love can do, where love can lead us, what we can do if we have love, and that's really powerful, and wrapping that in a military fantasy that is all about violence at its core, and about, a lot of dark stuff happening, I think is really brave, is really interesting, and makes it work much better than, other ways of telling that kind of story. Because there is still, a lot of casual darkness and casual stuff here, right? There's sexual assault. Arcana gets, not to put a finer point on it, raped by soldiers, and it gets talked about how to maybe slowly bring her back from there. There's trauma, obviously, again. There's ways of trying to deal with that trauma, and seeing Croker to finally become the dad that he never could be with his own daughter because of it's also really nice, because we see there is still goodness in him somewhere, as much as he may disparage it himself, and he gets to live that out before he becomes, basically the ruler of a bunch of worlds by taking over that job. So we end the story sort of as a mirror of the first one. When the first one starts with Croker falling in love with an all-powerful dictator, that being Lady, We end this with Lady being just a mercenary and Croker being the all-powerful dictator. And it's the love between the two that will raise the other one up. And we'll see where that will go in future books if they come out, when they come out. I know they will become. They're supposed to come out very soon. So I just wanted to sort of ram that point home. I've read these books 4 or 5 times now. And I start crying near the end of Soldiers Live every single time because it is so impactful. And I was already choking up a bit here right now just talking about it. And I think that is one of the important powers of the Black Company, especially these later books. And I think you can talk about like whether, you know, some of the language is a bit outdated nowadays because we have changed a lot in the last 20 odd years. So we can talk about that. But I think there's a strength with the Black Company that I want to highlight before we end this all. See, Glen Cook uses a lot of language with his background, its military background, with this being military fantasy. He used a form of military fantasy to talk about very important topics, about very human topics, about, topics like love, like, even if he doesn't use the term toxic masculinity, but like how machismo and how being sort of stuck in these specific toxically masculine roles, these hard-ass roles, kind of prevents people from actually showing emotions, from having healthy ways of dealing with trauma, of dealing with, well, the everyday struggle of life. And we have that all the way back to the first novel, to Black Company, the beginning. I think it's it's a Raker chapter, I think, when the group comes back from that raid, and Croker describes in detail how everyone is deliberately not asking questions because while you may be worried, you can't show that worry. So these topics have always been in the book. They are a bit more out in the open in the last novel, a bit more clearly framed, but they've always been there. But by using the language of dudes, the language of mostly men, of men that have grown up in under patriarchy in a lot of ways, of men that have grown up like me in not necessarily the most healthy environment, that have taken on a lot of these practices for ourselves, our behavior and so forth. He speaks a language that people like me can understand. And the fact that he manages to get me to cry about like these topics by using a thoroughly masculine sort of like language, a thoroughly masculine genre, like masculine in like a way that is, very masculine coded, male coded in a lot of ways, I think is part of the strength here. Because whether, fantasy has become incredibly inclusive over the last decades, not that it has ever been, just white dudes, but they have been, we have been very much dead center of the genre, both as readers and as writers. And while I am incredibly happy that it has become so varied in both gender, sexuality, ethnicity, everything really, bringing all these global perspectives, bringing all these new perspectives to fantasy, I think that's a brilliant thing. I love reading these books. I think we sometimes forget or are in danger of forgetting that there are still a lot of, middle-aged white dudes or younger white dudes trying to become middle-aged white dudes out there who are still trapped in those specific systems of oppression, because let's face it, being a dude under patriarchy is still sucks, right? So having someone who is able to speak to that and make us actually pay attention, make us sit up and get it, or at least be able to understand his language in a lot of ways, I think that is incredibly helpful and that is incredibly powerful. The Malazan Book of the Fallen does a similar thing, but because Stephen Erickson's prose is so much more elaborate in a lot of ways, it is less accessible. The Black Company is very, very accessible. It allows people like me to think about topics like love, friendship, about my inability to, share my feelings, stuff like that. It allows me to think about these things it picked me up when I first read it as a teenager, at a place where I was mentally, and able to understand. And every time I go back, I discover more nuance, I discover more detail, I discover more layers to these stories, new things to think about, and still that core message of, well, family, brotherhood, love, the things that make us human. It's other people that keep us being human. It's not, just our inner moral code. You can be Mogaba and stick to your inner moral code for most of the time, but it will still lead you astray. It is other people. It's our relationships to other people, whether we call them found family, whether we call them brothers, sisters, friends, whatever. And the emotion underneath that is something we should probably just call love, because love is not just, sexual love, although that is obviously in there in these books as well, but it's all these different forms of love that keep us going, that keep us from becoming completely antisocial monsters. It's that thing that makes us human. And Glen Cook manages to wrap that in a language that people like me could understand when I was a teenager, and that I can still understand. And I think that's valuable in its own right. So I can forgive some of the things that I think haven't aged as well. Some of the language, there's some homophobia in there in the early books and in later books coming up from time to time, but it's fairly mild. And then we have queer characters in these books that are just like completely normal. So there's progress within these like 25 years or however long it took Glen Cook to write these books. So we can see times shifting, but the underlying message of being human, of trying to forge connections, because that's what keeps us going, finding reasons why we do things, and these reasons should be other people and not some goal like glory, vainglory, anything of that sort. Having that underlying message, I think, is a very strong one, and couching that in military fiction, in the terms of military fiction, in the terms of military fantasy, is important, because a lot of military fantasy and sci-fi that is out there tends to slip into the older language of heroism, of glorifying war, of glorifying deeds of violence. A lot of epic fantasy in general does that. And the fact that the Black Company manages to not do that, I think, is on the one hand something that makes it so popular with people that have a military background, because they kind of know. And on the other hand, is helpful for those of us who have never had anything to do with the military and have only seen the media's depiction of military life that tends to either condemn it completely or glorify it completely, but the understanding that it's just people trying to survive doing people stuff. I think that's a very powerful message, and that's, I guess, one of the reasons why The Black Company is, when I look back, probably my favorite fantasy series of all time. So yeah, thanks for sticking with me through all these years, through all these videos, through all these ramblings. I hope you got something out of it. I hope you at least find some of the things that I find in The Black Company as well, and I hope you appreciate them as well. If you find other things in The Black Company that you love, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your opinions, to read your opinions, to know more about it. I am very interested in all of that. Thank you very much for sticking with me. Like, subscribe, comment. There's a Patreon if you feel like giving me money, but you don't have to. I'll be back with something else, hopefully soon. And until then, thanks and cheers.